1990, and Harrison Ford is at it again. This is Presumed Innocent.
Carolyn Paulhamus was murdered last night. Some creep got into her place somehow and strangled her.
It looks like she was raped.
Rusty, I want you to handle this case personally. You're the only one around here I can trust. Just catch me a bad guy.
You're in charge of this investigation?
There are 150 lawyers down there. They couldn't find one who didn't sleep with her.
Find out which of the creeps she put away is out on parole.
She's dead, and you're still obsessing.
You were in Carolyn's apartment the night she was killed. We've got the fingerprint results. There's a call from your house to hers that night.
This is absurd.
Go ahead, play cool. I know. You killed her. You're the guy.
Why didn't you tell me about you and Carolyn?
This is my life. We're not talking about some gossip.
Indeed, you will go to trial.
You're still in love with her.
Hello, Movie Punditry. Welcome to another episode of Random Rewatch. This is Mike, and I am here with the 1990 Alan Pakula film Presumed Innocent, starring Harrison Ford, Raul Julia, Brian Dennehy, Bonnie Bedelia, Paul Winfield. So some of you may be familiar with the series that is currently running on Apple Plus with Jake Gyllenhaal, Presumed Innocent. That is another adaptation of this story, which actually comes from a 1987 legal thriller novel by a guy named Scott Turow. He's written a bunch of these novels, a lot of them set in a fictional place called Kindle County, which is seems an awful lot like Chicago. So this novel wound up with a lot of people really interested in getting the filming rights for it. Even before the novel was published, studios were kind of fighting over this property. Finally, in 1986, Sidney Pollack and Mark Rosenberg secured the rights to it. Like I said, this was before the novel was even published. And they hired screenwriter Frank Pearson to pen a script for it. Originally, they had the film set up at United Artists. For whatever reason, that didn't work out. The project was moved over to Warner Brothers, and they brought Pakula in to rewrite the script. And eventually, he worked with Pearson on another couple of drafts of the script, and then he actually wound up coming in to direct it as well. This movie, this like legal suspense thriller, this is right up Pakula's alley. He's best known for a trio of films in the 1970s which have been dubbed the Paranoia trilogy, and that's Clute, The Parallax View, and All the President's Men. So this is a guy who is well versed on suspense, these kind of thrillers, these procedural legal thrillers. Perfect guy to helm a film like this. He would go on to do The Pelican Brief. He'd also done Sophie's Choice. Really successful career this guy had. So they had some problems with adapting the novel into a screenplay. First big problem being is that the novel is told largely in first person from Rusty Savage's point of view. And that's a difficult thing to do in a screenplay like this. The second problem is that the novel is told largely through flashbacks. And at this point in time, I mean, it seems like flashbacks are all the thing now in every single movie. But at the time, in the late 80s, flashback movies were not really a big thing. And so there wasn't a lot of experience, and people weren't used to watching that type of a story. And so they had to convert this kind of first-person flashback story into a forward-moving narrative, which runs into the third problem, is there's just an awful lot of plot in this film. What do I mean by that? By plot, I mean the events that are happening that drive the story. So, in a script like this, you have plot and story. And the plot is kind of the external factors that happen to somebody that move your story along. And the story is kind of the interior journey, what happens to your characters, what their arc is, and the sequence of events that they do, and whatever their inner conflict is, right? So the plot is there's this galactic empire and there's a rebellion, and somebody has stolen plans to a ultimate weapon, and those plans have to get to the rebellion. The story is the ship is captured, and the Leia gives the plans to the droids, and the droids meet up with Luke Skywalker, and Luke meets up with Ben, and they have to decide whether or not they're actually going to try to fulfill this mission. That's the story. This story, Presumed Innocent, has a ton of plot in it. There's all these different things that happen. The death of Karen Palamas, who Rusty is, all the different things that are trying to happen throughout the story. And so they have to kind of meld all of this stuff into a forward-moving story. Originally, Pearson's idea of the story was there was going to be a lot of sex and blood and violence and action in this, but Pakula wanted this to be more about the central theme of justice and what happens to the various characters in terms of what is just and what is right for them. And that's kind of the way the story wound up developing. So there was casting going on. Robert Redford was considered, but Sidney Pollack thought he was too old for the role. Kevin Costner was offered the role but turned it down. But Pakula's point of view was he always envisioned Harrison Ford in this role. Once he came on board, Harrison Ford was the only one that he offered the role to. There were some people, including Scott Turow, who didn't think that Harrison Ford could really pull it off. Harrison Ford wasn't sure that he could pull it off. The problem being that Rusty Savage is a very kind of interior character. Everything kind of happens to him versus other characters that Harrison Ford has played, like Indiana Jones, like Han Solo, where he's a very exterior character. He's driving the action forward. That's not Rusty Savage. Rusty he's kind of going along for this ride, and it's kind of things that are happening to him, and all the other characters are the ones who are kind of making all the action happen. And that was not something that Harrison Ford was used to at this point. But he read the book, and he had some conversations with Pakula and decided that it would be an interesting role for him to tackle. As part of that development process, Harrison Ford was one who came up with the idea of the buzz cut that Rusty has. It seems like a really small thing, but he really thought that particular haircut kind of really expressed who Rusty Savage was, and that it made him stand out as being different from other characters that Harrison Ford had played, that an audience would come in and see him looking like this and know that, okay, we're not getting Han Solo in this. We're getting something different. He did the same kind of thing in Mosquito Coast, where he had long hair. So that whole it's kind of method, really, when you think about it. That whole kind of approach to a holistic approach to the character is something that Harrison Ford takes pretty seriously. Harrison Ford wound up, and Pakula wound up sitting in at a lot of murder trials, watching training videos like the prosecutor's office in Detroit had in order to prepare for the role. Paul Winfield sat in with judges and in various trials and trying to get an idea of how judges behaved and what their thought processes were. He went out for this role. It wasn't a casting call. This was something that he actively sought after. And when he got the role, he hooked up with a judge in New York, and the judge in New York made him wear like a judicial robe and sit in the courtroom and watch all the goings on so he could get, a feeling of what a day in the life of a judge was and what a judge would be doing, would be thinking, would be looking at, would be considering during a trial. Raul Julia likewise met with criminal defense attorney and went through some cases with him, observed him in court and in conferences, and talked to him about how he prepared defenses, the type of thing that he looked for. There was a lot of rehearsal. They did a few weeks worth of rehearsal so the actors could get to know one another and get to understand how each one of them acted. The film was filmed in Detroit, Michigan, a lot of it was, and Windsor, Ontario. There's those ferry scenes and stuff that you see. all the interior stuff was done in New York City at Astoria Studios. And I think there were some externals, probably the externals of the house was in New Jersey. But really Detroit and for the exterior city stuff and New York for all the interior stuff is where this film was filmed. So that's about it on pre-production. This is a typical, 90s studio film, so that stuff kind of happened without a lot of fanfare. And let's get into Presumed Innocent, and starting with this really fantastic opening monologue.
I am a prosecutor. I'm a part of the business of accusing, judging, and punishing. I explore the evidence of a crime and determine who is charged, who is brought to this room to be tried before his peers. I present my evidence to the jury, and they deliberate upon it. They must determine what really happened. If they cannot, we will not know if the accused deserves to be freed or should be punished. If they cannot find the truth, what is our hope of justice?
I should point out that the music, this is John Williams doing this music, and there's this piano motif that just continues throughout the film. But the entire score is really, really good. So then we meet Rusty Savage, or Rosette K. Savage. Rosette, that's an interesting name. I'm not really sure what the origin of that is. Anyway, he's taking a ferry to work. We meet his wife, Barbara, who's played by Bonnie Bedelia. A lot of people may remember her from Die Hard, where she played Holly McClane. My first encounter with her was a film called Heart Like a Wheel, where she played Shirley Muldowney, the drag race driver. Anyway, Rusty goes to work. Rusty is the assistant prosecutor or the assistant district attorney of Kendall County. He's the kind of senior professional, non-political guy in the office. If Law & Order fans think, like Jack McCoy in the early days kind of thing. So they have this whole montage of him walking through the office, getting to know what's going on for the day. And I got to tell you, this office honestly really feels real to me. The people in it, his secretary, the other prosecutors, like it feels legit. It feels real. And I guess spending a lot of time with lawyers and judges and things like that, the cast and the director were able to really kind of make it feel authentic. But anyway, he gets called into the district attorney's office. The district attorney is played by Brian Dennehy, who was in a bunch of stuff along this period. Everything from, a feel-good movie like Cocoon to a movie like First Blood. This guy could do it all. And he was in a ton of stuff. And he generally elevates whatever he's in. So we got Brian Dennehy playing Ray Horgan, who is the district attorney. And he informs him that there's been a murder in the office. Another district attorney named Carolyn Polimas. I should mention out before that, Rusty gets a note in his office from Carolyn Polimas saying, "I know it's you and stop." Immediately, there's this kind of what's going on. So Horgan assigns Rusty, basically begs him to take on the investigation. You could see that there's some discomfort, there's something going on there, but he does. He gets his own, he asks for his own investigator, Dan Lippenzer, played by John Spencer from The West Wing. And you could tell that there's some tension. There's mention of a guy named Tommy Molto, who is, another district attorney who's the head of the homicide division. There's a mention of a guy named Nico De La Guardia, who we get the idea is running for election against Ray. And so we're off on this investigation. And so we see, I'm going to, kind of skip through this first part of it. We see this initial investigation, and things seem perfectly normal, although we kind of figure out that Rusty has had a romantic relationship with Carolyn. And, initially we're kind of like, well, that's got to be some kind of conflict of interest. There's this thing over phone calls. There's a lot of seeds being planted here. There's this thing over phone calls. There's this thing over evidence, physical evidence being collected. There's this glass, the fingerprints, where Rusty's like just running through known felons at first, where he's asking Dan to not make a big deal out of the fact that he was calling Carolyn because they had a relationship and he doesn't want to open up old wounds with his wife. I mean, there's all this stuff that maybe it seems normal, maybe it doesn't. But then there's this meeting where he gets called in to Ray's office, and we see Molto and Nico are in there, and they are accusing him basically of killing Carol Polimas. And he realizes that he's going to be charged with her murder, and now we're kind of off to the races in terms of this legal thriller. And there's been, like, throughout this investigation, like I said, there's been this bunch of clues. Like I said, the glass, the fingerprints, the phone calls. There's this thing about a B file, which was missing from Carolyn's office, and Ray had it, which is like some kind of special government bribery investigation that she shouldn't have been involved with because that wasn't her thing. She did basically like special victim stuff. She did rapes and sexual assaults. And then there was this other note in the B file about this person, Leon, and who Leon was. So we have all these little seeds that have been planted that will come back around later. So we wind up with him going home and telling his wife that he's going to be charged. So here's the thing, is this is one of these movies. So this movie obviously has a big twist at the end. And I'm going to assume that maybe if you're listening to this, that you've seen this 30-year-old movie. And if you haven't, maybe you want to go watch it and come back, because I am going to talk about the spoilers and the twist and everything that really goes on here. So we know on a second watch, we know that Barbara is the one who killed Carolyn Polimas. So it's interesting watching her reactions to this whole thing, because Rusty doesn't know that. It's interesting watching the way that she reacts, like when he tells her, watching it and knowing that she is the one who did it, and that she knows, this look of shock on her face when he tells her takes this whole new meaning on. There's so many layers of complexity, and there's such great acting performances in this between Harrison Ford and Bonnie Bedelia, and we're going to get to Raul Julia in a minute. A film like this that's so plot heavy and so dense in terms of the information that they give to the viewer has to be anchored by really great performances. And on just about every step, this film is really anchored with these great performances. So anyway, so Rusty decides, he says, we're going to get a lawyer, we're going to get an expensive one. They decide they're going to mortgage the house, blah, blah, blah. And now we meet the incomparable Raul Julia. Raul Julia, a Puerto Rican actor who unfortunately passed away 4 years after this movie was made. So 1994, way, way too early. He was 54 years old. Just such an incredible actor. Stage, television, movies. He's got a SAG award. He's got a Golden Globe award. He's got an Emmy award, 4 Tony nominations, Drama Desk award. I mean, this guy is just amazing. Wound up with, unfortunately with stomach cancer, and continued to work even though he was suffering, and just did some amazing, amazing performances, and really worked right up until his death. 5 movies in 1990. He did a movie in 91, Addams Family. He did The Plague in 92, Addams Family Values in 93, Street Fighter in 94. I mean, this guy just continued to work. And he was doing television work at the same time and doing theater work. He was in Macbeth when this film came out. He did Othello, and he did Man of La Mancha in 92. I mean, just such a prolific guy, and really, really elevates anything that he's in. One of my favorite roles of his is a film I hope we get to do is Moon Over Parador, which is just this great, funny film, kind of the better earlier version of Dave, where Richard Dreyfuss plays this actor who's hired to replace a South American dictator who is taken ill, and Raul Julia plays the prime minister who's kind of orchestrating this whole situation. Raul Julia is so fantastic in this film. And one of the things that on the most recent rewatch that I did when I watched the film for this podcast was to wonder if he realized that it was Barbara who had done this all along. There was one moment where the three of them were meeting, well, the four of them, because Bradley Whitford was in the room as well, but where they were meeting and Barbara said something and Sandy just gives her this odd look. You know, it could be written off as, well, that was a weird thing for her to say, but it almost, in a rewatch, it almost kind of looks like he understands why she's saying it because she's responsible. And Sandy just has so many insights. And as a defense lawyer, he's working all these multiple angles. He's working, we're going to disprove the evidence and we're going to work on impeaching the witnesses. But I also have this thing going on in the back with the judge, and we'll talk about that a little later, where I can put some pressure on the judge to dismiss it, and I'm going to work all three of these things at the same time and see which one of them is really going to make it work. And he doesn't even really disclose all of his strategies to his own client, who should really understand what's going on. But Sandy just kind of keeps everything so close to the vest that his revelation at the end is just really amazing. So they go and they find out that Ray Horgan is on the witness list, and so they go have a meeting with him to find out what it is he might say. And to say the least, Rusty is a little blown away by what Ray is planning on testifying.
My new partners. I'm here 3 days. I got a grand jury subpoena.
I was wondering what we might expect in terms of your testimony.
I'm going to testify about Rusty's conduct of the Paul Hemus investigation. How he volunteered to handle it.
Just a second. Raymond, you insisted I take it on.
I don't remember it that way, Rusty.
Raymond, what are you trying to do to me?
What am I trying to do to you? What are you trying to do to me? I thought I had your loyalty. Why didn't you tell me about you and Carolyn?
Raymond?
Under the circumstances, I have to advise Rusty not to respond. Clearly, he would like to.
So my question is, like, why is Ray Horgan always so willing to perjure himself and betray Rusty like that? Is he worried about, the partners at his new law firm? Is he worried that someone is going to find out about him and Carolyn Palamas? I don't really see what the problem is with that. I mean, they were both unmarried at the time, even though there was a conflict because obviously she was his subordinate. Is he just worried that people are just going to realize that his house at the district attorney's office was kind of a mess? That's the one piece that just kind of seemed a little contrived, I think. But other than that, now we move we're moving forward in following this B file. We have a couple of courtroom scenes, preliminary stuff. We meet our judge, Laren Little, played by Paul Winfield, the great Paul Winfield, who he's another one who just always brings it, whether he's in Star Trek or he's in The Terminator or whatever other roles he's in. He had tended to do kind of a lot of smaller movies. The guy's been around since like 1967. He was in Trouble Man. I guess that's kind of important. He shows up in TVs or he shows up in a film as doing a character actor role and hits it all the time. So there's this great bit with him and Nico and Tommy where they're trying to get some evidence in, and they're trying to say that Rusty, when he sarcastically said to Molto, "Yeah, you're right, I did it," that was like a confession, and he was just not having that.
You're right? Yeah, you're right. Your Honor, the man admitted the crime. Oh, come on, Mr. D. LaGuardia, really? You tell a man he's engaged in wrongdoing, and he says, yeah, you're right. Now, everybody knows that's facetious. We're all familiar with that. in my neighborhood had Mr. Savage come from those parts, he would have said, your mama. But in Mr. Savage's part of town, I would think they would say, yeah, you're right. And what they mean is, you are wrong. Just to be polite.
But we're continuing on with this investigation and following up on this B file. And Dan and Rusty kind of find out that this file involves this guy, Leon Wells, and they track Leon down, and they basically kind of pressure him into admitting as to what happened, and that he had paid somebody $1,500 to have the criminal charges against him drop. Carolyn Polimas was the go-between, and it turns out that this person, eventually they discovered that this person had to be the judge, Laren Little. He had been involved in this kind of bribery thing, which is why he is always kind of pushing back against Sandy bringing the bribery file up, because he keeps saying that it's not relevant. But on the other hand, he's also slapping down the prosecution a lot. So Sandy's kind of got these three pokers in the fire. He's got the bribery case, he's got the missing evidence, and he's got this story he's coming up with that Nico and Tommy are framing Rusty. He's kind of putting all that together. His job is to put reasonable doubt into the minds of the jury, to give the jury a reason to say, yes, something else could have happened, and this is what he's doing. But the best scene in the entire thing, I think, is Sandy just absolutely taking apart Dr. Komagai, the bones, the medical examiner, from start to finish. This is just honestly one of the best courtroom cross-examinations that I've seen on film.
Does it not follow, given these facts, that the specimen you sent to the chemist was not taken from the body of Carolyn Polimas?
I can't account for it.
Oh, so you don't know what happened? Wherever you got that specimen from, Doctor, you sent it to the chemist while you were having secret communications with Mr. Molto behind Mr. Savage's back. Am I right?
Do you accuse me, Mr. Stern?
Sit down, Doctor.
Oh, I think we have had enough unsupported accusations for one case. Dr. Kumagai.
And Raul Julia really has this way of talking, you know, his Puerto Rican accent, his stature, the cadence of his voice, where he's like, he comes across as being someone who is, you know, very cultured and refined, but yet the sarcasm and the vitriol that he has is absolutely coming through it. So when he says, you know, at the end of that, where he says, you know, we've had enough baseless accusations for one day, and he says, Dr. Komagai, you know, it's just disdain. You can hear the disdain in his voice, even though he is being completely proper in the way that he's saying it. So once we get to this part of the trial, it's actually a pretty short stretch to the end from here. Nico renews his request for Tommy Molto to testify, and the judge asks him about the glass. They don't have the glass. He wants to testify, and so the judge goes on this kind of long diatribe about how this is basically a miscarriage of justice.
After yesterday, there is no proof of motive here. There's no concrete evidence that there ever was an intimate relationship. There is no effective proof, so far as I am concerned, that would give a reasonable person grounds to believe that Mr. Savage had carnal relations with Miss Polimas on the night of her death. In point of fact, there's not one shred of direct proof that Mr. Savage murdered Miss Polimas. So under these circumstances, I cannot allow this trial to continue. Mr. Savage, You are discharged, sir.
And he winds up dismissing the case. And since the jury is in the room, the jury's been sat, then this is dismissed with prejudice, meaning that he can't be retried. So Rusty is basically off scot-free. He winds up having a conversation with Sandy, which Sandy asks Jamie to leave. And then he has this very solemn moment where Sandy is like, what we speak of now, we'll never speak of again. And then he begins to tell him the story about Laren Little.
We speak now tonight, and these things are never spoken of again. Agreed? Laren's divorce left him in a state of disorder. He was drinking much too heavily, and he fell into a relationship with a beautiful but self-serving woman. The fact is, Laren himself grew suicidally depressed. He wanted to resign from the bench. Raymond Horgan talked him out of it.
Raymond knew he was taking bribes?
Laren told him. Raymond cleaned up the North Side, as you recall, and he also rescued a distinguished mind and a career that does honor to the bench. I believe Laren today did what he thought was just. You tell me, Rusty. Was justice done?
And so we see the three ways that Sandy has really been playing this whole thing. The glass, the fact that the glass wasn't there, impeaching the evidence that was there, specifically the test results with the medical examiner, but also this B file that he was holding over Judge Little's head because he knew that the judge was the one who had taken the bribe. And so it was kind of an ace in the hole for him. They have this conversation about whether or not Rusty had done it. To Sandy, that obviously doesn't really matter that much. I mean, as a defense attorney, I'm sure all of your clients are like, yeah, I didn't do it. And for a lot of defense attorneys, at least the ones on TV, it's about holding the system accountable. If the state can't prove its case, then the accused should go free. Whether or not the accused actually did it, we need to hold the state to a higher standard so that innocent people don't get railroaded and put in prison. Now, obviously, we know that doesn't happen. We know that the system fails all the time. But a lot of times with these lawyers, especially in movies and television, we see it's about the process. And I think that's probably true with Sandy. So anyway, Rusty's free. The whole thing's over. He's back at home. He's fixing the fence. Goes to get a weird little hammer axe and finds blood and hair on it. And he knows immediately that Barbara has done it. And he's down in the basement. He's washing up because she went through all this meticulous planning and wouldn't have washed off the hammer. That seems a little odd, but okay. Rusty has to find it. And then she has this really kind of dissociated monologue with him. She comes home. She was successful in her doctoral presentation, so she says, I did it. And then she sees the hammer, and now she confesses, basically, to Rusty.
You understand what happened had to happen. Couldn't have turned out any other way. Woman's depressed with herself, with life, with her husband who had made life possible for her until he was bewitched by another woman, a destroyer. Abandoned. Like someone left for dead. She plans her suicide. Until the dream begins. In the dream, the destroyer is destroyed. That's a dream worth living for.
That's basically the end. There's another little piece where Dan comes to Rusty on the ferry, and turns out that he has the glass. You know, Rusty's a little taken aback. He's a little in shock about it, but Dan is like, hey, they took all the files from me. They pulled me off the case and told me it was none of my business anymore. They never bothered to ask me if I had the glass. I figured somebody would ask, and they never did. And then Rusty's like, you know, he's looking at Dan, and he's like, do you think I did this?
The very next day, I get a call from the lab. The test is done. I can come pick up my glass. But when I went down there, Molto had signed the receipt returned to evidence. You know, I guess the idea was that I'll put it back in. Only I got nowhere to put it anywhere, since it ain't my goddamn case anymore. So I tossed the thing in my drawer. I figured sooner or later somebody's got to ask me. Nobody did.
You think I killed her?
The lady was bad news.
So that makes it okay I killed her.
Did you?
I tell you, I love John Spencer. I love John Spencer and everything he's in. Obviously, he was amazing in The West Wing. He was great in L.A. Law. He was great in The Rock. And he's great in this. The fact that he lets Rusty off the hook is really pretty great. And so that's it. We're done. Rusty's free. His wife did it. Nobody's ever going to charge her. There's no evidence. The glass is gone. It's at the bottom of Lake Michigan, I suppose. And that's it. And we wind up back in the same courtroom that we were in the beginning. And there's a closing monologue that kind of mirrors the first one.
The murder of Carolyn Palamas remains unsolved. It is a practical impossibility to try two people for the same crime. Even if it wasn't, I couldn't take his mother from my son. I am a prosecutor. I have spent my life in the assignment of blame. With all deliberation and intent, I reached for Carolyn. I cannot pretend it was an accident. I reached for Carolyn and set off that insane mix of rage and lunacy that led one human being to kill another. There was a crime. There was a victim. And there is punishment.
So, how did we do? So this film, $20 million budget, made $221 million in its box office run. So I think it did pretty good. Did 86 domestically, 135. It fared pretty well on the critics. It's got an 86 on Rotten Tomatoes, 72 on Metacritic. Cinema Score, it's got an A-. You know, we always check in with Roger Ebert. Roger, 3.5 stars. He clearly liked this one. He makes a point about how this film is so well crafted that even though he had read the book, he wasn't sure how it was going to turn out. He said, everyone who has read the book will, of course, have a good idea of what way the story is likely to unfold, but the producers have cleverly floated the notion that the film could turn out differently than the book. The best I can say is, having read the novel, I was nevertheless in suspense during a great deal of the movie. Even if you think you know what the solution is, the performances are so clever and the screenplay by Frank Pearson and director Alan J. Pakula is so subtle that it could well turn out that your expectations are wrong. So high praise from Roger Ebert here. So this film, what you probably know is that this film, the novel, was readapted this year. In fact, it's an ongoing show on Apple TV as a TV series, Presumed Innocent, with Jake Gyllenhaal and Ruth Negga as Barbara. It's created by David E. Kelly with J.J. Abrams, Ben Stevenson, Dustin Thompson, and producers. And it is a slightly different retelling of this story, and I will just leave it at that. What you may not know is that there is a sequel to this film, a direct sequel to this film, that takes place supposedly 20 or 30 years later. The novel was written, it's called Innocent. It was written in 2010, and it was put to film in 2011, starring Bill Pullman, Marcia Gay Harden, Richard Schiff plays Tommy Molto, Alfred Molina plays Sandy Stern, and in this one, Bill Pullman playing Rusty Savage is now a appeals court judge, and there's another murder, of course, and his wife is involved, of course, and honestly, the less said about this, a TV movie, and probably the less said about it, the better. There was a follow-up mini-series that was done in the early 90s called Burden of Proof, which was based on another novel and is really about Sandy Stern. Hector Elizondo plays Sandy Stern. Brian Dennehy is in this movie, but as a different character. As far as I remember, Rusty Savage is not in it. So these novels and their follow-ups have had a lot of stuff. This is kind of like a John Grisham situation where people are taking Scott Turtough's stuff and just optioning it out. And that's it. But this is the 1990 movie Presumed Innocent. And let us know what you think. Thank you for listening. Our next year is going to be 2000. So I'm looking at films in 2000. But I have a pretty good idea what I'm going to do. And if you know me and you know this channel, you probably have a pretty good idea what we're going to do. So once that's all settled in, we will see you. And thanks for listening. Make sure to check out the rest of our stuff, the Movie Punditry Show and our House of Dragons show, and tell your friends about us. Thank you.